Welcome back to the Developer Diaries. We are back here in episode 10 with Principal Software Architect and Microsoft MVP, John Kilmister, to talk a little bit more about good learning practices for developers. So John, you mentioned in our last episode that continuous learning was something that's really important, right? Could you give us a brief overview of what that is again? And then we'll dive deeper into things like the T-shaped developer and key skills that people should be paying attention to as they're sort of going from becoming a student into a developer and, further into their career.
Yeah, so continuous learning is really just about keeping your skills fresh and continually looking for continually building on the skills that you have, and also diversifying and various other things. And that can be done in so many different ways, and for each person that might be different. So for me, that means going to user groups and reading blog articles and following people on Twitter and things like that, so that I can get a broad appreciation of what's out there. I'm not going to understand all of those technologies in depth, but I know, there's a tool that does that. I've heard about it at this user group, or there's been this, this different way of doing something that I've seen at a conference that I've then gone back and looked at deeper. So I guess the first kind of level of it is having a broad awareness of what's going on in the industry as a whole. Now, there are thousands and thousands of things out there in the software engineering area to learn. Even if you look at my specialist area, I guess now is kind of Azure. There are, I think, about 200 or so services in Azure, and you can't be an expert in all of those. So, or even know about all of them. But yeah, the first bit I would say is about getting that broad awareness of what's going on. The next bit is experimentation and play. So not all engineers will have the luxury of being able to write code outside of their work time. Would fully appreciate people have families and other things that they want to do. But having time to experiment with code and see, I wonder if it can do that. I wonder if it can do this, is a really important thing. And different times present different opportunities for that. So some companies I've worked at have 10% time, which allows you to spend 10% of your working week on proof of concepts, ideas, and new things, or taking existing technologies that you use in your company and repurposing them for other things that benefit the organization. But it's that kind of learning side of it. Personally, although I still get time in my work life to do a lot of that, I also then use some of my own personal projects to go and experiment and play with bits and things that interest me that I wouldn't necessarily have time for. But as I said, that's not always for everybody. So yeah, it does depend on your situation.
Yeah. And then, I love that you mentioned meetups. Sorry, I cut you off. I love that you mentioned meetups. I think it's something that you don't really realize is a good opportunity to learn until you're already in the industry. And I guess students are sort of doing it casually when they're meeting up with other student organizations and going to those types of meetings. But what are the key things that you like to learn when you go to meetups and you're meeting developers there?
So at different times, it's different things, which I know doesn't directly answer the question, but I may look at the topic and I don't have a clue about that area. So for me, those times are learning about the broad aspects of that technology. I went to a talk where someone was talking about supercomputers, and I don't ever see myself needing to program a supercomputer, but it was interesting nevertheless. Other times, things like data science and things like that, it's definitely not my area, but having an appreciation for it and being able to, I've been in organizations where there are teams that do data science, being able to have a conversation with them and understand what a data warehouse is versus, and various other technologies is useful. And then other times they're topics that I've done a little bit in, and it's great to see how other people have approached a problem. because there's always more than one way of doing things. So you'll always learn something, even if the least you learn is a presentation skill or a technique. So, and then in addition to that, there's the opportunity to speak to other developers in the local area. And that is really valuable. When I've been looking for jobs, I've reached out to those contacts that I've had. But equally, when I want some advice, I've reached out to those people as well. So yeah, it's a really good networking opportunity as well.
Yeah. And I also really like what you mentioned about having the 10% rule in companies where they sort of give you that time to focus on things outside of your current, pipeline and things that you have to work towards. But like to take it the next step further, implementing something like that with the side projects that you're building outside of work, just in your personal life to say, hey, I'm going to set aside this percentage or this fraction of time every week, to just hack on cool projects. And I know some people do it casually just at home. Some people do it at a more like I'm going to live stream building this project, or I'm going to build it and then write a blog post about it. Right. So there's different ways of going about doing something like that.
Yeah, definitely. And so that's one reason I kind of started my blog, which was only started 2 years ago, was that very reason, to give me a bit of motivation to actually finish a side project or a prototype or proof of concept.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's often about how you can weave it into your work as well. So if your organization doesn't give you 10% time, but at the beginning of a project in your team, you're introducing a new technology, taking that, go, oh, I don't mind having a look at that, and then going off and learning it and being the person in the team that goes and investigates that new technology. So it does depend on your organization, but that can happen. When I do a new project with a team, I like to only bring in 1 or 2 new technologies. So we know kind of 80% what we're doing, but we might be bringing in a new version of Vue.js or something like that, or we might be using a new messaging framework. So there's always something new that we can all kind of learn and move forward, and it's useful for the project. We don't just pick it because it's shiny, but it is relevant for the project. But yeah, someone's got to learn that at the beginning and help the team get up to speed and things. So
Yeah. And you've mentioned previously that there's this model called the T-shaped person or the T-shaped developer. Can you talk us through what that model is and why that's important to follow?
yeah. So this is a concept. I can't remember who originally came up with it, but there are many blog posts out there that talk it through, and it really actually echoes the things that I've been talking about already. That you can't specialize in everything. But equally, being a generalist will be a challenge as well, because especially when you're looking for a new role, if you say, well, I don't mind what I do, it does leave a bit of question marks over kind of, well, where does this person fit in the organization? So being a T-shaped developer really talks about having a broad range of skills, but then being able to specialize in a small subset of those. So if I look at like my skills at the moment, obviously I've been in the industry some time, so this might be different for other people, but I've done some front end work. I've done some React and various other front end technologies. I've briefly touched on some mobile development as well, and some various other bits and pieces. But my kind of specialist areas are kind of in the .NET and Azure space at this particular time. And that's probably another key thing, is that you don't have to stick, to those specialities. Over time, they'll develop and change and adapt as your needs kind of arise. But the concept is that you, at a very high level, and as I said, there are lots of blog posts on this, so it's worth having a look at, is having a broad range of skills. And that will grow over time. But then focusing in on 1 or 2 key skills that when you're in a job interview, you can sort of talk about at more depth and go, this is where I'm looking to specialize. However, if you need me to turn my hand to, I don't know, setting up a build server in order to build my projects, then I don't mind doing that. Or, I might be a really good JavaScript developer, but I also know a little bit about containerization, and I can put my code in a Docker container and then pass it over to somebody to deploy. So it's about having those broad skills, but then specializing in one or two areas.
Yeah. And a lot of these broad skills are sort of driven by your own interests as well as
Mhm.
the work that you're doing at the company that you're at, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So it doesn't have to be like trying to figure out what it's going to be. It usually just happens naturally based on your passions and your current projects.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think something that's really important is to be able to turn your hand to many different roles, or many different jobs and things. You're going to be expected to do that, especially if you're in a smaller team. So larger organizations and larger teams will have more specialists. When you're in a smaller organization with smaller teams, there are a lot more generalists might be the wrong word, but everyone has to do a bit of everything. So and that's great, but yeah, your role as an engineer isn't necessarily just sitting down and writing your backend.net code, or just sitting down and writing your JavaScript front end code. There will be other technologies involved, as we briefly mentioned,
Yeah.
and other things that you need to know about.
Yeah. And we also briefly sort of spoke about when we were talking about continuous learning, how just the industry moves so fast, right? Things are changing so quickly. It can become really overwhelming to try to keep
Mm.
up with everything, right? So, how does a developer who has a full time job, who's working on all these main projects as well as their own side projects and going to meetups and everything, how do you keep up with everything?
It is really hard. I think the way that I've chosen to do it is, firstly, I've decided to go with a subset of the space by focusing on Microsoft tech stack. Now, these days, that is much broader than just .NET and Azure. We are talking a lot of open source things are also part of that kind of portfolio. But I'm not looking at Java, for example, or C or C++, embedded systems or game programming. I've kind of put a line there and said, I don't. That's not kind of where my coding is going, and they're on the very peripheries of what I would look at to keep up to date with and things like that. So I think setting some sort of like boundary might be the wrong word, because it's a very loose boundary. And as I said, I've been to talks on topics that I'll never work in, but I've just vague interest in. So setting a rough kind of boundary of the area that you are particularly interested in, and that's a very fluid boundary, but just at least seeing the corner of the that you're interested in, and then from that you can engage with that community. And those communities have meetups, they have conferences, they have newsletters. If you're a Java person, you can subscribe to Java newsletters and you will get news and updates from that. So I get a lot of mine from email newsletters and from the people I follow on Twitter. But there are lots of different ways in doing that. And I'm not necessarily using all of the things that I learn and hear about, but like I said earlier, with the user groups, it's always that kind of, oh, I've heard about this thing in the back of my mind. And then when I come to do the next project and I go, okay, I need to do something around authentication, I will then set aside some time to go and investigate that. And I can use, obviously I'll do my research again, but if I've learned a little bit about one of them through something else, or it might be something gets flagged up we've just had the Microsoft Build conference recently. Some things came out of that. For example, there's been a few things that come out of that. And then I've been able to go to people in my organization and say, oh, did you realize this is coming out? It's in preview at the moment. We should start looking at it. And they may give you the opportunity then to spend a bit more time investigating it and trying it. So yes, it does depend on your role in the organization, and it does depend on that. But you might get work time to look at these things, but often that's driven from your own interest and your own kind of, oh, we could look at this kind of approach to things.
Yeah. We also spoke a little bit about public learning and how you build
Mm.
content, you write blog posts about the projects that you do. And it's a great driver to sort of finish that project, right? Once you get started, to have a reason to reach the end line and then have something that you can present out to the world. You do encourage public learning to other people. Do you have any advice for people who might be shy, who might not feel comfortable having a public, persona? Um, in trying to be public learners?
Yeah, so it's really surprising. I think people think that everything that you write, well, you must be an expert in that topic in order to write about it, and that's not always the case. I will start with a topic, and I think, okay, I'm really interested in doing a particular thing. So recently at work, I was exporting some metrics from Azure, right? And I'd done a little bit of research and chosen a way and completed that. I decided to then write that up as a blog post in my own time. And I then went and read the Microsoft documentation to make sure that my blog post was totally accurate and I hadn't made any mistakes, and that everything was right. And I learned new things in that process. But I guess the most important thing is that everybody's got something to share. Maybe it is a story about how you developed something and it didn't quite go to plan, or you started working on something, got to a dead end and went off in a different direction. So talking about your experiences and your journeys, I personally find is a lot easier because it kind of flows more naturally, and you're an expert in your own story. So even if you're not sharing deep technical information with people, sharing that story and that journey, something that you are an expert on because it's your experience, is a really good way to get started. And it's also a way for you to then go away, fact check, and learn a little bit more in that. Or you can pick a new topic and completely learn it from fresh, then write up about your learning experience and be honest. That's the key with all of this, both in your work life and in your public learning. You have to be humble and be honest about what you do and don't know. Every day I find myself saying, I don't know that, I'll go away and learn it, or I've heard about that but I'm not an expert on it, and making sure people are fully aware of that, but then going on to explain your story. I've done a little bit of it and here's my experience. So it can be daunting, especially if you're worried about negative feedback and things like that. But
Yeah.
what I would say is that everyone has something to share, even if you don't initially think so, and just get started. I set my own goal of writing one blog post a month, and that is so that I always make sure I do it. Otherwise, it'll fade away and not happen. So
Yeah. I like that goal. And I think it's interesting. In my experience, like learning publicly, people are a lot more invested in you when you're struggling and when they see that you're like unable to learn something and you go through that process of saying, oh shit, I don't get how to do this. Okay, let me do some more research. Let me reach out to people, because they feel like they're part of that journey and they're sort of helping you along the process. I remember when I used to do like Twitch live streams in my senior year of college, like learning how to make websites and stuff and web apps. The most watched and supported live streams were the ones where I was just absolutely stumped and I did not know how to continue the project, and I needed to have people in the chat actually telling me how to continue building. So don't be afraid of saying, hey, I'm still learning and I'm stuck and I need help, right? Like people are a lot more willing to help these days. And then the other side of it was when you're building content, and this is just like a normal, like when you're in marketing or something and you're writing blog posts, it's a general rule. Set an audience for yourself. And I think that will really help you not feel as if you're trying to teach to the choir, right? Like if your audience is developers at your stage who also don't have any experience, it lowers the stakes significantly. So you can talk about something that you're not an expert in because the people that you're talking to are also not experts and they're also learning, right? You don't have to write a blog post that's going to be targeted towards someone who has decades of coding experience, because then you're sort of putting yourself in a really tough spot where you feel like you have to, get everything correct when you write about it. And that's not necessarily the person who's even going to end up reading the blog post.
And we're all still learning. And like it's every day I'm Googling for the answer of something. It's still a continually, as we said earlier, there is so much to learn, and there is so much that we're doing for the first time, that we're all continually learning. So I think that isn't necessarily something that we talk enough about, is that people entering the industry might be like, oh, I don't want to say anything because I'll look like I don't know anything. And the reality is that, unfortunately, most of us, at differing levels, have that struggle. That we're still learning, we're still working it out, and it's just that with experience becomes new ways of finding the answer quicker. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't know. It's just that you learn those skills on how to get to the answer in a more constructive way.
Yeah. It's easier to empathize with someone when you do have a lot of experience, when they admit that they don't know and they need help figure things out, as opposed to someone who just like gets everything right off the bat and doesn't need any support whatsoever.
Yeah, and also, I mean, work environment particularly, having people who don't kind of reach out for help, and then they say, oh no, I'm fine, and it's all going well, and then you speak to them 2 weeks later and you realize that they were struggling on something that we could have helped them with. And it's disappointing, but the people are always willing to help. And the feedback you get from public learning, I found to be really beneficial. People saying, oh, have you thought about doing it this way? Or, oh, you've mentioned this, did you realize this? And I've replied, actually, no, I didn't know that. And I learned something from the process as well.
Yeah. Is there like any one actionable step I can take right now or within the next 24 hours that'll help me become a more well-rounded T-shaped developer?
Oh, that is an interesting question. I think if you haven't kind of found your specialist area, have a think about that, and think about the kind of area. Specialist area might be the wrong word, but an area you would like to focus on and that you'd like to make your primary skill. So if you're not there yet, that is something worth thinking about. And as I said earlier, you don't have to stick to it forever, but it's a nice kind of marker to guide you to that community of people who are also interested in that area. So I would say if you haven't kind of had a think about what's the one area that you really want to focus on for now, then that is something I definitely recommend people to do. And if you have found that area, then seek out the community that is behind that. There will be other. That's the great thing about the internet. There's always someone else interested in the same thing that you are out there somewhere. So go and find them.
I love that. Thank you so much, John, for all of that advice and walking us through how we can be more well-rounded developers. We'll see you in the next episode of the Developer Diaries.
Thank you.